There are some stories you hear once and can never forget. They don't come from movies or books, but from ordinary people who swore these things truly happened to them. Tonight, you'll hear 3 accounts that begin with something small. A neighbor who stares too long, a house that should have stayed empty, footsteps where no one should walk. But each story builds into something far more unsettling. Watch closely. Time 0.65 as. Listen carefully and decide for yourself what to believe. And if these stories send a chill down your spine, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Story 1. The Man in the Old Car. I was 30 years old in 2022, working long shifts as a nurse in a small hospital in Ohio. At that time, I lived alone in a modest apartment complex with a shared parking lot. The place wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, and after the stress of 12-hour shifts, I thought peace and routine were exactly what I needed. At least, that's what I told myself in the beginning. It started with something so ordinary I almost didn't notice. Time 0.95. Around 1 in the morning, when I was getting ready for bed or just settling onto the couch after work, I would hear the slow rumble of an engine outside. Every time, it was the same truck, a faded blue pickup, the kind that looked like it belonged to another decade. The truck always parked in the same spot, directly beneath my bedroom window. And inside, there was always a Mitsa. Time 0.95. At first, I thought maybe he lived in the building. People have odd schedules, right? Maybe he worked nights. Maybe he was visiting someone. But as the weeks went by, I realized he never left the truck. He didn't get out, didn't light a cigarette, didn't even turn on the interior light. He just sat there, still, his silhouette barely visible behind the glass. The longer it happened, the stranger it felt. I started paying attention to the details. The truck never appeared during the day, only after 1 in the morning. He never parked anywhere else. And whenever I peeked through the blinds, even if I moved quickly, I got the unsettling feeling that he was already looking back at me. Naturally, I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe he was a night security guard taking breaks. Maybe he was too tired to drive home. I told myself all kinds of things, because the alternative, that he was there for me, was something I didn't want to accept. But explanations didn't change the reality. Every night, that same engine hum, that same truck, that same figure sitting motionless in the dark. Over time, the silence became worse than noise. When someone just sits and waits without moving, time 0.65, it creates a tension that builds in your chest. I would lie in bed, pretending to sleep, but my ears were always straining for the sound of a car door opening, for footsteps approaching the stairs. I knew how ridiculous it sounded if I tried to explain it to anyone. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't coincidence. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts early. A man who shows up at the same hour every night, never leaving his vehicle, never speaking, never doing anything but watching. That's not normal behavior. And sometimes, what feels abnormal at first glance is actually the truest warning you'll ever get. Weeks went by, and the routine of the blue truck became something I dreaded every night. It was almost predictable. I would turn off the lights around 1 in the morning, hoping for sleep. And before long, the same engine would hum into the lot. The man never moved, never broke the pattern. But one night, something changed. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps right outside my window. Not the shuffle of leaves or the scratch of a branch in the wind, but heavy steps, pressed down with intention. Then came the sound that froze me completely. The deep, labored rhythm of someone breathing just on the other side of the glass. For a moment, I stood there gripping the sink, paralyzed. My heart hammered so loud I could hear the blood in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to move. I crept to the window and pulled the blinds apart just enough to see outside. But the instant I did, all I caught was the faint glow of taillights as the blue truck reversed slowly out of the lot. The space beneath my window was empty, as though he had vanished. The strange part was that the night air felt heavier than before, as if someone had just been there, watching. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that his behavior was escalating. Sitting silently in the truck was one thin time 0.95s. Standing directly outside my window was another. So I bought a pair of cheap security cameras online, thinking maybe proof would give me leverage if I had to call the police again. When I finally set them up, part of me hoped they would capture nothing at all, that maybe the whole thing would fade if ignored. But the first real recording came sooner than I expected. It was just past 2 in the morning when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I opened the live feed, and there he was, the man from the truck, stepping into frame. This time, he wasn't content to sit in his vehicle. He walked straight across the lot, right up to my window. My chest tightened as I watched him lean closer, his hood slipping back just enough for me to see his face in the faint glow of the camera's infrared. His eyes didn't wander. Time 0.65s. Didn't blink. They were locked directly on my apartment. Then, slowly, he pressed his forehead against the glass and dragged one gloved finger across the condensation, writing something I couldn't read from the angle of the camera. The gesture was deliberate, patient, almost taunting. When he finished, he just stood there, staring at some, before walking calmly back to the truck and driving off like nothing had happened. The next morning, I showed the footage to the police. 2 officers came by, watched the clip, and admitted it was odd. But that was as far as they went. They reminded me that the man hadn't broken inside, hadn't damaged property, hadn't made a direct threat, without a crime. Their hands were tied. One officer even shrugged and said, "Until he actually does something, there isn't much we can do." That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every shadow across the wall felt like him returning. By the end of the week, I decided I couldn't keep living like that. I started packing, preparing to break my lease, time 0.65s, no matter the penalty. But the final straw came the morning I was set to leave. When I opened the door, there was a folded piece of paper wedged beneath the frame. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, scrawled in black ink on lined notebook paper. I unfolded it with trembling hands, and the message was short but clear. "Tomorrow night, I'll knock." I can't describe the chill that ran through me in that moment. It wasn't just fear. It was the realization that he had been patient all along, waiting, escalating step by step. I didn't spend another night there. I left that day, never to return. And to this day, whenever I think back on that blue truck, I wonder if leaving when I did was the only reason I never had to hear that knock on the glass. Story 2. Abandoned house on a hill. Back in 2021, I was working as an electrician, taking on all kinds of odd jobs to keep money coming in. Most of the time, it was routine. faulty breakers, bad wiring, the usual headaches. But one assignment that year still lingers in my mind. A property manager called and asked me to inspect an old house sitting on top of a hill in rural Pennsylvania. According to him, it had been abandoned for over a year after the last owner passed away. Time is 0.95. The place needed to be checked before they could decide what to do with it. Driving up the narrow road, I could already tell this wasn't going to feel like just another job. The hill was covered in wild brush, the driveway cracked and half buried under weeds. When I finally parked, the house stood there, small and weathered, with its windows dark like empty eyes. No neighbors anywhere nearby, just silence and the sound of my own boots crunching on gravel. I reminded myself that electricity doesn't care about feelings. Power either runs or it doesn't. That kind of thinking usually kept me steady. But the moment I stepped inside, something didn't add up. The air was heavy, stale, like no one had opened a window in years. The floors creaked with every step. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the walls carried that faint smell of damp wood. None of that surprised me. What did surprise me was what happened next. There, hanging in the living room, was a single bulb attached to the ceiling fixture. I knew for a fact the utilities had been shut off more than 12 months earlier. The manager had told me twice. Yet the instant I crossed the threshold, the bulb flickered, time 0.95s, not just once, but a steady stutter of light, like it was trying to come alive. I froze in place, staring up at it, waiting for logic to catch up with what my eyes were telling me. My first thought was simple. Maybe someone had illegally hooked up a generator. Maybe there was still some residual current. But as an electrician, I knew that wasn't possible. Power doesn't linger for over a year. Circuits don't randomly come alive because a person happens to walk into a room. And yet, that's exactly what I saw. The longer I watched, the worse it felt. Each flicker seemed timed, as if the house itself was acknowledging me. The rest of the room stayed drowned in shadow, but that bulb pulsed above my head like a heartbeat. I told myself to keep moving. Times are 0.65. To treat it as just another faulty fixture. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad wiring. Something in that house had noticed me. I tried to shake off what I saw in the living room. A flickering bulb wasn't enough to send me running. I told myself I had a job to do. Still, as I walked deeper into the house, every step felt heavier. The hallway stretched into darkness, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. That's when I noticed a door slightly ajar at the end. It led into the master bedroom. The air inside was colder, as if the room hadn't been touched in decades. Dust covered the dresser, and the curtains sagged with mildew. But what pulled me in was the calendar hanging crookedly on the wall. It was yellowed, edges curled, but still intact. I stepped closer, brushing off a layer of dust with my sleeve. At first it seemed ordinary, just an old wall calendar. But then I saw the marks. Dozens of days circled in thick red ink, every circle jagged, pressed down with a heavy hand. And next to those dates, written in the same red, were 3 chilling words: final call. The phrase repeated again and again, time 6/5s, scattered across months, sometimes 2 or 3 days in a row. My first thought was medical. Maybe the old owner had tracked phone calls from a hospital, waiting for results, waiting for the end. But the circles didn't match appointments. They were random. And the more I looked at them, the more they felt less like reminders and more like warnings. I backed out of the room, trying to convince myself it was grief, nothing more. People leave strange traces when they live alone. But as I made my way toward the kitchen, I saw another door, one that led down to the basement. My instructions were clear. Check every room. Make sure the wiring wasn't compromised. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand, staring into a black void that seemed to swallow sound. Eventually, duty pushed me forward. The basement smelled of rust and damp earth. My boots echoed on the concrete as I scanned the shelves lined with paint cans and broken tools. Everything looked normal, or as normal as neglect could be, until I noticed the clock. It hung crooked on the far wall, an old wooden clock with cracked glass, the kind you'd find in a schoolhouse 50 years ago. Its hands were frozen at midnight. I was about to move past it when the silence shattered. The clock began to ring. Not once, not twice, but a steady, violent chime that echoed through the basement like it was announcing something. My heart stopped when I counted the strikes. 3 o'clock. But when I checked my phone, it was barely 11:40. The clock was hours ahead of reality, yet it rang as if it knew something the rest of us didn't. Each chime rattled the shelves, sent dust raining from the beams above. The sound was so sharp it seemed to dig into my bones. I stood frozen in place, clutching the flashlight, unable to breathe. It wasn't possible. No power, no batteries, no reason for a dead clock to scream into the night. And yet, it did. When the ringing finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It felt absolute, pressing in from every corner. That was enough for me. I turned and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, barely remembering to grab my tools on the way out. I slammed the front door behind me, jumped into my truck, and didn't stop driving until the house was a speck in the rearview mirror. I didn't finish the inspection. I didn't even call the property manager until days later. And when I did, I told him straight. I wouldn't go back. He didn't argue. He sent another worker instead. A few weeks later, I heard the story. The man they sent never came home. No resignation, no warning, no calls. He just disappeared after accepting the job. People whispered about him leaving town, but his family never got answers. And me, I never set foot on that hill again. Even now, when I think about that night, I can still hear the clock's chime echoing in my head. 3 o'clock in a basement where time had no business moving forward. And I can't help but wonder if those red circles on the calendar were marking more than just days. Maybe they were marking victims. Maybe they were marking endings. Story 3. The attic of the rented house. In 2020, I was a broke college student in Texas, desperate for a cheap place to live near campus. When I found a small one-story rental with peeling paint and creaky floors, I didn't hesitate. The rent was low, utilities were included, and the landlord didn't ask many questions. For a student on a budget, it felt like the best option I could get. At first, the house was exactly what it looked like. Old, worn down, but harmless. For the first few months, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The pipes rattled, the windows whistled when the wind pushed too hard, and the floorboards groaned whenever I walked across the living room. None of that bothered me. Old houses make noise. I could live with that. But around mid-semester, I started noticing something different. Something I couldn't explain away so easily. almost every night. Usually a little after 4 in the morning, I would wake up to a sound above me. At first it was faint, almost like the creak of wood settling. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. They weren't random creaks. They were footsteps. Slow. Deliberate, crossing from one side of the attic to the other, as though someone was pacing right above my bed. The first night it happened, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the attic hatch. My heart pounded as I climbed the shaky ladder and poked my head through the opening. Nothing. Just dust, cobwebs, and old insulation scattered across the beams. I stood there for a while, time 0.65 and he says, shining the light into every corner, telling myself I must have been half asleep and imagining it. But as I climbed back down, something unsettled me even more. The smell. It was faint, almost easy to miss at first, but definitely there. The acrid, bitter scent of burned wood. Not fresh smoke, not a fire that had just gone out, but the lingering, charred smell of something that had burned a long time ago. The scent seemed to come from the attic itself, drifting down every time I opened the hatch. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an old electrical fire had damaged part of the beams years ago. Maybe the smell just never went away. I even asked the landlord, but he brushed it off with a shrug and said, "It's an old house. You get old smell. Time 0.95s. That explanation didn't satisfy me, but I didn't push. I told myself it wasn't worth obsessing over. Still, the pattern continued. Every few nights, the same thing. 4 in the morning. Footsteps above me. Then silence, as if whatever was up there stopped the second I held my breath to listen closer. And always, that faint smell of burned wood, creeping down like a reminder of something I wasn't supposed to know. The footsteps above me continued for weeks, and while I kept trying to explain them away, deep down I knew something wasn't right. Houses settle. Wood creaks. Animals sneak in through cracks. But footsteps have weight. They carry rhythm. And the ones I heard in that attic were too deliberate to belong to a raccoon or a shifting beam. Still, every time I checked, the attic was empty. That constant contradiction began eating at me. Then one night, while climbing the ladder to check again, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the inside of the attic door, faint but unmistakable, were scratches. Not random marks from age or nails driven carelessly. These were long, uneven gouges in the wood, clustered around the lock. They looked like someone had dragged their fingernails, or maybe even tools against the door, clawing to get out. My stomach twisted as I ran my hand across the grooves. They weren't old either. Some were fresh, exposing raw wood beneath the faded paint. I told myself maybe the landlord had tried forcing the hatch open once. Maybe some animal had gotten stuck. But the more I looked, the harder it became to believe. The scratches came from the inside, pressed outward. That meant something, or someone, had been trying to push through. From that point on, sleep didn't come easily. I started staying up later, headphones on, TV blaring, anything to drown out the sounds I knew would start around 4. But of course, one night, exhaustion won. I fell asleep. Sometime in the dark hours of early morning, I woke suddenly. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I felt it. Tiny grains of dust landing on my blanket. I reached up and touched my chest, and there it was, grit from the ceiling. Slowly, I tilted my head at time Garo .65s, staring at the faint outline of the attic hatch above me. Something was moving up there. The boards creaked, one after another, right over where I lay. Before I could convince myself to get up, the sound came. A whisper. Not a full voice, not words shouted into the night, but the quiet vibration of vocal cords brushing the silence. It was so faint I almost thought it was in my head, until it formed a phrase. Don't let me down. Durnam. I froze. My body refused to move. I could hear the weight of someone shifting directly above me, the subtle drag of breath that didn't belong to me. The whisper wasn't pleading. It wasn't desperate. It was commanding, patient, as though whatever was up there had been waiting for me all along. Time Bo 95s. I lay in bed until the first trace of daylight cut through the blinds. The moment I could, I threw some clothes into a bag and walked out without looking back. I didn't even bother locking the door. Later that day, when I called the landlord to tell him I was leaving, he didn't sound surprised. In fact, he almost sounded tired, as if he'd had this conversation before. That's when he told me something that still makes my skin crawl. Years earlier, a fire had torn through the attic. A man renting the place at the time never made it out. According to neighbors, the flames had swallowed the top floor before help arrived. The landlord didn't go into detail, but the way he said it, flat, almost resigned, told me enough. Others had left the house the same way I did. Suddenly and without warning, time 0.95s. No one ever stayed long enough to find out what still lingered in the attic. I never returned for the rest of my things. I didn't want them. To this day, whenever I wake in the middle of the night and hear the faint groan of wood above me, I hold my breath and remind myself that I moved, that it's a different ceiling. But deep down, I can never be sure. Because once you've heard that whisper, you never forget it.